You stand in a yard in southern England, and the smell hits you first, a putrid, thick, sweet rot that clings to the back of your throat, a heavy stench of decay that you can taste in the air before you even breathe it in, as dozens of emaciated men crouch on their hands and knees around you, clawing desperately at the muddy earth, their fingers caked with black grime, old tar, and dried blood, fighting like feral animals over rotting animal bones, weeks dead, collected from local slaughterhouse. Yards and dumped in the open air, the marrow inside decomposing into a foul fluid, but the men so utterly ruined by hunger that they split the bone casings open with rocks, scrape out the putrid green-black grease with bare fingernails, and gnaw at the decomposing flesh, swallowing what their starving bodies would have rejected only weeks ago. Some having done this for months on end, while the heavy iron rammers they should be using to crush these bones stand idle beside them, because this is the Andover Workhouse in 1845, and this is not a penal colony or a criminal prison, but a government-sanctioned institution built explicitly to manage the poor, a bleak network of over 600 massive stone structures spread across England and Wales, housing more than 100,000 desperate people at any given moment. An entire empire-wide machinery created by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 under the meticulous direction of social architect Edwin Chadwick and his driving economic principle of less eligibility. A calculated policy which dictates that life inside the workhouse walls must be worse by design, colder by design, and more miserable by design than the hardest, lowest paid, most precarious independent existence available outside the walls. Not worse by institutional accident or simple neglect, but worse by strict statutory law. So that if the workhouse were even remotely tolerable, a destitute person might willingly choose it over starvation wages in the fields, which was the exact problem the state set out to solve. And so they engineered an unbearable, calculated nightmare and called it parish relief, a system into which you are forced not because you committed a legal crime, but because you are a widow with 4 hungry children, an orphan boy with nowhere to turn, an agricultural laborer broken by 30 years of harvest work, a factory hand whose lungs are filled with cotton dust, or an elderly person at the end of 50 years of relentless labor, with nothing to show for it but a pair of crippled knees. And your daily existence here begins before dawn at 6 o'clock sharp, when the iron bell cracks through the freezing air of the crowded dormitory, and the work is already waiting for your numbed hands. The first grueling task being oakum picking, where old, thick hemp rope salvaged from decommissioned naval ships, soaked in heavy pine tar and sea salt for decades until it has hardened into something resembling twisted iron wire, is dumped in heavy bundles onto the floor, and you must sit on a backless bench for 10 to 12 hours unpicking it fiber by fiber with nothing but your bare thumbs, the dry tar cutting deep slices into your skin on contact, your fingers splitting and bleeding within 48 hours, your tendons adapting permanently over months of repetition to the curled position of the work until you can no longer fully straighten your hands. A permanent physical deformity documented by visiting medical inspectors who note it down on official sheets before assigning the very same task to the very same inmates the following morning, while the second job is the bone-crushing yard, where you stand in an enclosed courtyard with 9 other men, lifting a heavy iron bar over your head hour after hour to pound cattle, horse, and pig bones into a fine white dust sold to wealthy farms as fertilizer, breathing the white, grease-laden dust deep into your lungs for half the day without a cloth to cover your face, your skin coated in a film of animal grease. And the third alternative is the stone-breaking dock, where large rocks of flint or granite must be reduced with an iron hammer into pieces small enough to pass through a narrow metal gauge ring for road gravel, a task performed outdoors in freezing rain, sleet, or scorching heat in a uniform made of cheap wool that scratches the skin and turns heavy when wet. A task that a free laborer outside gets paid 6 pence a day to perform, meaning your version inside must be legally engineered to be far more painful and degrading than 6 pence a day, the absolute destruction of your elbows and wrists over time serving not as a design flaw, but as quantifiable evidence that the deterrent policy is functioning perfectly, a form of survival labor meant to break your will rather than build your future. And the food that keeps your heart beating is strictly limited by a legal document called the Workhouse Dietary, which specifies by ounce and penny exactly what is permitted to enter your body, consisting primarily of gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from a scraping of oatmeal boiled in water, alongside a single block of stale bread measured precisely by weight, and on rare, specified days a portion of boiled meat the size of a matchbox or a suet pudding that sits heavy in an empty stomach, every single mouthful eaten in absolute, mandatory silence, because speaking across the long wooden tables is classified as a disorderly breach of discipline, forcing hundreds of starving people to sit in long rows, collect their cold allocation, chew without looking up, and file back out to the yards under the watchful eyes of guards, an experience of consumption stripped of any social humanity, where asking for a second helping is a punishable offense that will land you in the dark cell. An institutional reality captured accurately by Charles Dickens when he visited these gray bastilles and wrote Oliver Twist, showing that the board of guardians' absolute outrage when a child held out his bowl was not a fictional exaggeration but a direct reflection of a system that viewed a request for more food as a fundamental challenge to the legal order the entire British Empire existed to enforce. And the very water you use to swallow your bread comes from shallow wells dug too close to the workhouse cesspools, carrying invisible armies of bacteria that trigger epidemic outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and cholera that sweep through the building in waves, while tuberculosis settles permanently into the damp stone walls of the dormitories where beds are shared by 2 or 3 strangers at a time, sleeping head to toe on iron frames, the air so thick with breath and sickness that the annual mortality rate inside the worst institutions easily exceeds 10%, turning these buildings into what the local townsfolk openly call death houses. Though dying within these walls is not the ultimate terror that keeps you awake at night, because the Anatomy Act of 1832, passed just 2 years before the workhouse system was overhauled, gave licensed medical schools the absolute legal right to claim the unclaimed corpses of anyone who dies in a state institution without a relative coming forward within 24 hours to pay for a private funeral, meaning that if you die in your bed at midnight and your daughter is locked in the female ward across the courtyard and is not notified of your death until 36 hours later when the paperwork clears, your body is loaded onto a timber cart, driven to an anatomy theatre in London or Manchester, sliced into pieces by medical students for dissection practice, and dumped into an unmarked mass grave filled with lime, a terrifying fate for the Victorian working class who hold deep, unbreakable religious beliefs regarding a proper Christian burial and the physical resurrection of the flesh, knowing that the state which stripped your dignity in life will legally trade your flesh in death, and the chapel inside the walls offers no comfort, for attendance is compulsory, and the chaplain's sermon hammers home the lesson that your poverty is not an economic failure of the nation but a direct consequence of your own moral laziness, an individual sin that must be purged through submission to the workhouse master who holds unchecked, autocratic power over your daily existence, a man who can cut your rations, lock you in a windowless solitary cell for days. Or have you dragged before a magistrate to be sent to a hard labor prison if you refuse to pick your daily quota of oakum, an institutional framework that invites horrific physical and structural abuse, as documented in hundreds of coroner reports and parliamentary inquiries revealing systematic beatings of young children, starvation used as a management tool, and the routine sexual exploitation of vulnerable female inmates by male staff who know their victims have no legal standing to complain, because an inmate who attempts to report abuse is instantly punished for making false allegations against an officer of the Crown, the entire inspection system run by government officials who give weeks of prior notice before visiting, spending their time drinking sherry in the master's office while reviewing paperwork the master produced himself, ensuring the cruelty remains safely hidden from the public eye unless a sudden death or an undeniable pregnancy forces the truth into the open. And if you are a woman entering the system, the machinery of the state grinds you down with specific, cruel focus, cutting your hair close to the skull on the very first day to strip away the one element of dignity and femininity allowed to a working-class woman, before separating you entirely from your family, dividing parents from children and husbands from wives into distinct, isolated quadrants of the stone complex, where mothers can hear their infants crying through the brick walls but are forbidden from crossing the courtyard to hold them, forcing couples who walked through the front gate together to spend years under the same roof without ever exchanging a single word, while you are forced into an invisible cycle of domestic labor, washing hundreds of sheets, scrubbing stone floors until your knees bleed, and cooking the very gruel you are forced to eat in silence, while unmarried mothers are singled out for public humiliation, forced to wear dresses made of coarse yellow or bright red cloth to visibly brand them as fallen women before the entire population of the house during chapel and meals, an explicit policy recorded in the minute books of the Board of Guardians to ensure the moral taint is displayed every hour of every day, and yet beneath the silence and the labor, there is a sound that lives in these buildings that the official tables never record, a phenomenon documented by rare journalists, doctors, and reformers who stepped outside the master's office and walked the dark corridors at night, a sound they recorded in private journals and letters to their wives as the workhouse wail, a low, deep, collective murmur that rises from the crowded women's dormitories after the lamps are extinguished, not an active cry or a sharp scream of panic, but a continuous, rhythmic exhalation of hundreds of voices groaning in unison without opening their mouths, a sound that one visiting inspector in the 1840s wrote reminded him of an industrial slaughterhouse in the quiet minutes before the cattle understand the blade is coming, the sound of human beings whose active resistance has been completely crushed by the weight of the institution, whose minds have stopped forming protests, but whose bodies continue to produce a mechanical groan of endurance, the sound of a person who has passed beyond despair into a state where they have stopped fighting but have not yet stopped breathing, and yet this system does not break down under the weight of its own horror. Operating for 114 years, until the last official workhouse gates are finally closed in 1948 with the birth of the National Health Service. Because the human beings trapped inside find a way to adapt to the cruelty, lowering their expectations of life until the simple act of waking up tomorrow morning becomes an act of defiance, finding quiet ways to survive the winter, to share a crust of bread in the dark, to pass a message to a child across a yard, or to ensure that a fellow inmate's body is claimed by a friend before the anatomy cart arrives. Surviving not because the suffering made them better people, but because they refused to allow the state to completely erase their existence. A brutal history showing that the Victorian workhouse was not a system that failed through neglect, but a system that succeeded precisely because it was designed to make poverty hurt, a monument of stone and iron built by the wealthiest empire on earth to ensure that state relief was more terrifying than starvation itself. So if this raw, hidden history gave you a perspective you did not have before, hit the subscribe button now, because every single week we pull back the curtain on the parts of our past that are the hardest to look at but the most vital to understand, and leave a comment below sharing what choice you would have made to keep your humanity alive inside these stone walls.